And welcome back. Let's go ahead and get ready to get our enemies added to our game. Now, before we get started here, one thing that we're going to do is, if you're having issues with your players still occasionally getting stuck on things, you can come in here and add the material for that wall friction, because remember what the wall friction was, kind of slide on things. So we can add that into our feet here for that kind of that box glider that we kind of put there along the bottom. So if you do that, that's a good way in case if we're getting stuck on things, you can add that in there. But now in terms of the enemy, we're going to move over to our sprites here. And of course we have this orb type enemy that we can use to go ahead and add a enemy into our world. Now, of course, we can put the enemy in various different locations. For our testing purposes, I'm probably going to drop them in here because it gives us a nice good zone for us to kind of test it out and make sure we get the behaviors that we want. So let's go ahead and get ready to add this in here. Now, of course, you might think, okay, I know what to do. So if that's the case, you can go ahead and see if you can make sure you get everything in here that we're about to do. So let's go ahead and create a empty here, and we can go ahead and name this. Since this is a orb type enemy, I might call this orb, and I'm going to just put in parentheses enemy, just so that way I know what exactly this orb is. It's an enemy type, and so I'm going to do that, and you can see it's now in here. And let's just go ahead and make sure everything is reset here on our transform here, just so we can have that. And then I'm just going to go ahead and drag that back over and put it right in over here in this zone where I want it to be. And now we can get ready to add some components. Let's start first by adding our sprite renderer. And so we can add that in. That's going to, of course, give us some information. We're going to expand it up because we're going to want to, of course, add in the appropriate information. Now let's give our default sprite layout here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my orbs here. And I'm just going to take this first position, which is kind of our neutral position here. Just going to go ahead and drag that on in here to our orb. And you can see right now it's showing up behind everything. So that means, of course, we need to adjust our sorting layers. So let's go ahead and add a sorting layer here. We just hit add, and we'll call this our enemies layer. And I probably am going to move that for now to be above or below the player. So we want that player to always be on top. And so that looks good there. Let's go back to our orb and make sure we apply that layer. So we want them to be the enemies layer. And so now if I look, here is, of course, that orb existing here within my game world. The next thing we need, because we were going to have collisions and stuff like that, we want to add in our rigid body 2D. So let's go ahead and grab that rigid body 2D. And we will, of course, want to make an adjustment to that. We don't want a dynamic type. We want kinematic because we do want some things to happen. We don't want to make it full on static or dynamic because, again, we're not really worried about it, bouncing off walls or anything like that. So the kinematic is working fine because this orb is ultimately going to kind of just move left to right here in its movement. Now, because we do want to have some collisions, we need to add a collider. So I'm just going to collapse some of these other pieces here just so we can have those all the way. Let's go ahead and do a capsule collider 2D because we do have this kind of round shape here. And I'm going to zoom in so I can get much more accurate. So let's go ahead and edit that collider and just bring that in so we can kind of get more of that accurate shape that we're going to want to go for. So again, bring that in here. Just kind of bring it in so it gets nice and close. And we can take that offset. Let's bring that, we're going to, of course, adjust the X and Y position. So I'm going to bring that down so it's kind of right over that. Might have to increase the size just a little bit here so I can get the nice good match. But that's looking pretty good there. So again, we got a nice good collider here now. And lastly, since this is going to not be just a static sprite in world, we need to have an animator added to this because we want to have, again, this to have animation to it. So let's go over to our animator panel and get ready to go ahead and animate this sprite. Now, of course, this animation right now is set for the player, and we don't want to mess with that. So let's go back into our animations folder here. I'm going to right click and choose to create now a animator controller. Of course, we already have our player controller. So let's do this for our orb enemy. All right, you can call it, orb enemy controller or orb enemy. I'm just going to keep it orb enemy because it'll be simple enough. And I know that's what this is. And of course, we don't really have much right now here in our window. You can see it's pretty basic. We don't have anything in here. So we're going to have to go ahead and build out some animations. So to build that animation, let's head back to our sprites, find our orb. And now we can, of course, set this up. Now, of course, if you look, we have a couple different things going on here. So we have a kind of looks like a static motion, and we have some kind of almost like the orb is reaching out and lashing out with some violence here. So we have a couple different things that we can do with this. So we could, of course, take all these, and it's going to, be the animation that we want to be. Or we, of course, can just, if we just want to move back and forth and just have these effectively as our three states, we can do that as well. I'm going to leave that up to you which way you decide to build this. I'm going to probably start with, of course, just these 3 states here for movement. And then I could later make, for example, an attack state that's going to use these 3 states. So let's just use these 3 here. And I'm just going to go ahead and right click. And let's go ahead and create our animation with this. And you can see it names right here. So we're just going to call this orb animation, or orb anim, however you want to call it. I'm just going to call it orb animation. And let's drag that into our animations folders just so they're, again, all in the same spot. And now that I have that orb animation here, here it is, orb animation, I can then add that into our animation, our animator layer here. And you can see now entry is now pointing here to orb animator, or orb animation. So we, of course, have some animation now. Cool. So here, of course, is our orb animation. We, of course, need to make sure we have a couple other things set up in here. We need to say, well, what is this actually working with? So if we go back to our different enemies here, our orb animation itself, one of the things we need to make sure we check, of course, is our loop time, because we want that to constantly be repeating, because if we don't do that, it's not going to repeat. It's going to just like sit there and not ever go through that animation. And let's click back on our orb enemy. And remember, we need to go back into our animator and say, what controller are we using here? Because right now we have, of course, nothing in there. So we want to specify that as the orb enemy controller. And let's quickly save everything and give that a run just to see if this orb is doing what we want it to. And so I'm going to have to move the player here. And you can see there it is. It looks like it's kind of pulsing very angrily. So that is, of course, cool. We have animation with this orb. Now, one thing to note is that our orb here was kind of moving a little fast. If you're fine with that speed, you can do that. But I'm just going to go adjust mine real quickly. And the way I'm going to do it this time is I'm going to go to my samples here and actually adjust it this way. And so the samples is how many times is it, pulling in this animation. So this is another way for us to kind of adjust this just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and change our samples to 6. So I'm cutting it down. You notice that the timeline here has changed here just a little bit in this presentation. So if I go back to my orb now, and let's go ahead and have the player just drop, you can see it is now slowed down, which of course, that is probably a little bit closer to what I want that to be. If you're fine with it moving faster, that's fine as well. But again, just something to kind of test around with. But I think this is a good stopping point here. We got our orb in here. We, of course, could do other things like make this in prefabs and stuff like that. But I think before we do that, we may want to set up some of our movement and stuff like that. So that way we can have all those behaviors kind of programmed onto this. And then once it's a prefab, or we can turn it into prefab, so then we can make additional enemies into our world.